of the Supreme Court on the religious rights of Indian citizens is ambiguous and his scope for overriding the doctrine of principal distance in Indian secularism. Justify your answer highlighting the Supreme Court's doctrine of essentiality was evolved by 7-judge bench. Doctrine of essentiality was evolved by 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court in the Sirur Moot case 1954. 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court in order to determine the extent of religious freedom followed by religious groups. Extent of religious freedom followed by the religious groups. The court held that the term religion will cover all the was evolved by 7-judge bench. 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court in the Sirur Moot case in 1954 in order to determine the extent of religious freedom followed by the religious groups by individuals. The court held that the term religion will cover all rituals and practices integral to a religion and took upon itself the responsibility of determining the essential and non-essential practices of a religion. However, the Supreme Court putting the onus on itself of determination which practices are essential to religion, which are not, has made it ambiguous on the religious. Ambiguous on itself of determination which practices are essential to religion, which are not, has made it ambiguous on the religious. Rights of Indian citizens over the practices. However, the case the Constitutional Bench has ruled that 1994 that mosque is not an essential part of the practice of the religion of Muslim, and namaz prayer by Muslim can offered anywhere, even in open. However, the case Indian Young Lawyers Association of State of Kerala Sabarimala case, the majority opinion in 2008 Sabarimala verdict had said that women have fundamental rights to equality in accessing public places, which includes places of worship. This was based on the Apex Court understanding that non-entry of women in the temple is a non-essential practice of religion. Triple Talaq, non-essential practice of religion, women in the temple. Triple Talaq judgment, pronouncing instant triple talaq is non-essential element of religion. Practice has made punishable by the legislative measure. Essential element of religion. Non-essential element of religion. The underlying argument of the Supreme Court rests on the premise of constitutional morality. The underlying argument of the Supreme Court rests on premise of constitutional morality and expanding nature of individual rights in order to intervene the religious practices followed by the community. The underlying argument of Supreme Court rests on the premise of constitutional morality and expanding nature of the individual rights. Rest on the premise of constitutional morality. Premise of constitutional morality and expanding nature of individual rights. Constitutional morality and expanding nature of individual rights. To intervene the religious practices followed by the community. Expanding nature of individual rights in order to intervene in religious practices followed by the community. Agreement Supreme Court. Morality and expanding nature of individual. The doctrine of principal distance. The underlying argument of Supreme Court rests on premise of constitutional morality and expanding nature of individual rights in order to intervene in religious practices followed by the community. The doctrine of principal distance implicates that state maintains principal distance from religious practices. State maintains principal distance from religious practices followed by the citizen as enshrined in Article 25 to 28 in the Indian Constitution. Principal distance implicates the state maintains principal distance. Conflict of doctrine of essentiality, the doctrine of principal distance. Scholars of constitutional law have argued that the essentiality doctrine has tended to lead the court into an area that beyond its competence and giving judges the power to decide purely religious questions. Scholars of constitutional law have argued that essentiality doctrine has tended to lead the court into an area beyond its competence. In some cases, they have relied on a religious text to determine essentiality. In other, it's relied on empirical behavior of the followers, and yet others based on whether the practice existed at the time. The religion originated, thus interfering in religious practices rendered the principal distancing null by the act of infringement. While pronouncing the judgment, a judiciary could emphasize religious freedom, emphasize community rights, while restricting itself on infringement. Through the principle of essentiality, the framers of the Constitution wanted to give this autonomy to each individual. The Apex Court has itself emphasized autonomy and choice in its judgment related to right to privacy 2017, homosexual 2018, adultery 2018. Autonomy. Emphasize religious freedom and community rights while restricting itself on infringement. The doctrine of separation of the power is essential